Welcome back, everyone. For those of you joining for the first time today, I'm Jamie Tassa, Director of Events for Chief Executive Group. Next up, we'll be digging into how to make lean and agile work for the COVID-19 crisis. There's no one better fit to provide insights to this topic than Nigel Thurlow, former Chief of Agile for Toyota Connected and CEO of the Flow Consortium. Nigel is an internationally recognized industry expert on lean and agile approaches. He leveraged the power of the Toyota production system and the Toyota way to enhance and develop agility in lean product development. He is the co-creator of Scrum, the Toyota way, and the co-creator of the Toyota Flow system, a new approach that blends the deep teachings of the Toyota production system with complexity thinking, distributed leadership, human factors, and team science. He is also the founder of the Toyota Agile Academy, a Toyota training and consulting practice helping organizations transform using these techniques. Prior to Toyota, Nigel led the successful transformation at 3M Healthcare Systems and has taught and coached in notable companies such as GE, Bose, 3M, Microsoft, and MIT. And as of 2019, he's trained over 6,500 people in Lean, Scrum, and Agile techniques. Get your questions ready. Dan will be back at the end of Nigel's presentations to get them all answered. Over to you, Nigel.
Hey, good morning, everybody. I'm just checking that everybody can see everything and hit show my screen, and we should be ready to go. Look at that. Everything's good. So good morning to everybody. I'd like to thank Chief Executive Group for having me along and to thank the team for having put together such a fantastic event given the current circumstances, and special thanks to Dan and Jamie for coaching me along and helping me along this process. A little bit about me. The introduction was very flattering. I was with Toyota till the end of last year as the first ever global chief of Agile and helped sort of meld the lean and agile worlds together to bring forward what was called Scrum, the Toyota way. And I'll talk about a few of those things during this morning's presentation. A lot of things I talk about are online. They're available completely free in the Flow Guide at flowguides.org, which some of the things I will talk about are included in that today. And I was the guy who trained the majority of people in Toyota on some of these techniques. We're in a very different world, so I thought I'd start with the reality check and talk a little bit about the impact that we're all going through. We've seen the disruption of our supply chains and logistics, the complete decimation of global air travel, and it's given me a lot more time at home, but I really do miss people. Consumer confidence and spending, of course, is down, and we're suffering from depressionary economics. So this phrase that has been used a lot in industry for some years is now becoming very clear. This thing called VUCA. We are very volatile at the moment. The world is extremely volatile. We're definitely in uncertain times, and there's a lot of ambiguity. And some of what I'm going to talk to you about is complex problem solving. So this really has come to the fore and become quite well focused on. And really, where does this leave us? What's the future of lean and agile? Were we too lean? Were we not agile enough? And to help us answer these questions, I put a few slides together to sort of look at what lean really truly means. Whether you're a Toyota production system devotee or you sort of follow the Lean Institute's lean thinking, the fundamental doctrine of the Toyota production system from its co-creator Taiichi Ohno is the total elimination of waste. That is the purpose of the Toyota production system and lean thinking, to reduce cost, thereby increasing value by the elimination of all waste. But alas, as Drucker said, efficiency is not enough. There's nothing so useless as doing efficiently that which should not be done at all. So being efficient isn't enough. And as the late, great Al Ward talked about when he was speaking about continuous improvement, a great mind in the lean world, he sort of said improving the system to prevent defects doesn't mean adding more tests and checks and gates, controls, more analysis. Improving the system means making things easier for developers. He was talking more in a software context in this particular quote, but generally in your organizations, it's about leadership management making things easier for the people who do the work, not harder. And we need to avoid something I call evil lean, a phrase I coined some time ago in Toyota. Slashing pay, and we've heard a little bit about that this morning, and slashing jobs isn't really the ethos of lean. And Toyota lost a lot of staff back in the 70s oil crisis, and then regretted that decision, and ever since have had the job for life policy. It's about looking to how we can use our workforces more effectively. And we need to avoid things like fake Kanban, as Ono called it, otherwise known as supplier bullying, which is where we reduce our own inventories, but then we push the problem down the chain to our suppliers. And Kanban only works just in time, which is Kanban is the heart of, only works if your production is correctly leveled. Use the systems as designed, not as people have abused them. So we're now talking about the offshore debate. I'm seeing all these new items, these news articles about let's move suppliers from, or our factory, our world factory from China to Vietnam, and some are even talking about India. So there's this big push to move the players in the game, but honestly, you're just shuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic. Changing the players doesn't change the game. We now need to look at how we become more resilient in this new world. But we have a balanced dilemma. If we move everything back onshore, if we shore up our supply chains and our skills and bring everything back onshore, then we're going to increase costs. The reality of it is things back at home cost more to make for a variety of different reasons. So we need balance with using our world's factory, whether that's China or Vietnam or another part of the world, with having the capabilities to be able to ensure resilience onshore. And we heard yesterday quite a lot about automation. I was fascinated with what Tom Bell from Rolls-Royce was talking about, and about the new supercell. But we do need to be careful of something called automation bias, which is the propensity for us humans to favor suggestions from automated decision-making systems and ignore contradictory information, even if we as the humans are correct. We end up with what's called a loss of situational awareness if we do that. The principle of JIDOKA from Toyota, otherwise known as Autonomation, is, well, we'll dig into the reason for it in a second, but the key point is we don't want to confuse mechanization with automation. We have a lot of plants and capabilities where when we walk around, and I've done this many times in Toyota plants, we see the automation, or what appears to be automation within the plant, but actually what it is mechanization that's replacing human muscles. What we actually want is to replace human judgment with automation, but the danger is when we move into the artificial intelligence world, which is where machines are thinking and working like humans, we lose the principle of JIDOKA, which is automation with human wisdom. Toyota often say automation with a human touch, but my friend Shingo-san, son of Shigeo Shingo, talks about automation with human wisdom. And automation creates jobs for skilled workers, but alas, at the cost of unskilled and semi-skilled workers. And it appears that Mr. Musk agrees with this. There was many articles last year about the Model 3 production challenges, and he came out and said, yes, excessive automation at Tesla was a mistake. To be precise, my mistake, humans are underrated. Now, I'm not against automation, absolutely in favor of automation, but we need to ensure we don't lose situational awareness. And this was an example in the 1970s of Eastern Airlines Flight 401. It crashed into the Florida Everglades because the pilots on board were so fixated, this is also called fixation bias, with a warning light that wasn't displaying for the right-hand landing gear. And they were trusting in the autopilot, but hadn't realized that they'd knocked the autopilot off, and nobody realized, and the plane crashed and hit the ground. So we need to be careful we don't completely remove the human element. And of course, the new word now is resilience. And I was talking about this the other day in another conference, and I said, I'm waiting to see the large consultancy groups arrive with their new resilience frameworks and resilience transformation. What we do need to do is maintain adequate inventory levels and, of course, retention of sufficient capabilities. But please do not rush to employ chief resilience officers. I've been doing this for about 20 years, and 20 years ago we were doing resilience, secondary sites, failover and disaster recovery solutions. Resilience is not a new topic. What we need to do is to find how we can use the tools we're aware of to be able to ensure we don't just outsource all accountability and responsibility and deplete our capabilities beyond recovery. But resisting old habits is hard. As executives, we need to unlearn old behaviors and we need to learn new tools. And I'm going to move on to talk about some of these new tools that I think might be beneficial in enabling lean and agility to continue as a focus in our organizations. But as Peter Drucker said as well, any innovation in a corporation will stimulate the corporate immune system to create antibodies that destroy it. So as soon as we start suggesting something new, we get attacked by the machine that pushes back and says, no, thank you, Nigel. And this is the reality. There are no prescriptions. You've all had plenty of consulting groups come through with their incredibly beautiful PowerPoint decks, and they will sell you the latest framework, whether that's design thinking or the current nonsense digital transformation. Digital is an enabler. You are not transforming your organization to be a digital business. You are using it to enable you to conduct your business. And about once every 3 to 5 years, you get a new prescription and a few more $1 million to spend. And the reality of it is context is key. There are many tools, methods, technologies, approaches, but context is key to determine the right ones to use and when. If you're digging for oil, I can warrant that's very different than if you're running frontline healthcare in our hospitals. And of course, we must acknowledge the work of the healthcare workers in this recent crisis. So let's look at a few of these tools for recovery. I want to share a little bit of work with you based upon Clayton Christensen's work from the 90s. We unfortunately lost him this year, brilliant scientist and professor. And I want to talk a little about disruptive innovation because we're all very familiar with disruptive innovators. We've got our friends at Tesla and SpaceX, where a disruptive innovator is somebody who's described who creates customers from where none exist. These are the people who are eating your lunch. They're taking your existing customers away and creating new opportunities where you didn't see any. They're disrupting you as the established players, and of course, they're exploiting those opportunities. Then we move into the disrupted imitator space, where a lot of you may be, and this is a very high risk and very expensive space to be. You're continuously chasing those innovators, those disruptive innovators. You may be growing by acquiring new competition if you have the funding for that. And of course, you're catching up by buying the new technology. And I actually place Toyota in this space, not because they lack innovation, but because a lot of the time what we did at Toyota and what they still do at Toyota is the best in the world. But they're not out there disrupting established players and bringing out the latest and greatest innovations. Companies like Tesla are doing that. And then we move into the imitator space where you find your names such as Walmart and Apple even. Apple may be ever evolving technology. I don't know if they're actually innovating in technology currently. And this is your commodity space. Now, if you're happy in this space, you're a commodity brand. You're probably competing on the differentiation on cost or quality, and you're growing through acquisition or sort of making your own version of known brands. And then, of course, we move into the innovator space, which is where you've got your new innovative inventors and creators who are hoping that you're going to put investment into them and sponsor them into that disruptive innovator space. Now, the important thing about this 2x2 is there's no wrong place to be other than that top left quadrant. I don't think you'd really want to be there. If you're happy in the commodity space, fantastic. If you're in that disruptive innovator space, you're probably leading the charge. So I want to ask the guys back in Chief Executive to take over and to run this little poll. I'd like to know where you currently think you are as an organization, considering that last slide. Okay, I think we're back. I didn't hear the audio while the poll was being run. I'm just waiting for the poll screen to clear. Okay, I think we're back. I'm just waiting for my slides to come back up on the screen. But so looking at the results, there's a lot of people in that disrupted imitator space, and that's a real problem. So I'm going to introduce a new tool to you. It's called Wardley mapping, created by an Englishman called Simon Wardley. And this is a real case study, a company I was working with. I can't tell you the name for legal reasons, but a large financial services company. And they had a number of initiatives involving about 1,500 members of staff and several tens of millions of dollars worth of annual investment into this. And the first thing we taught them is to distinguish between customers and users. Users are your internal users, stakeholders, shareholders, regulators, but they're not your customers. Your customers are your source of revenue. And so they ranked these major initiatives, these 15 key initiatives, which were probably a couple of $100 million worth of investment. And then we mapped them. We took them and we introduced them. It'll take a few seconds for this slide to build, and apologies for the animation in there. But we then gave them the ability to map these initiatives across a landscape. And first of all, in the vertical plane, we're looking at how visible are these initiatives to your customers, how many of them are actually impacting your customers and providing benefit to them, and how many of them are all focused on your internal users where there's no source of revenue, maybe important, but no source of revenue. And then in the horizontal plane, we were able to map these where should we be building these or doing the R&D on, and where should we, this is the buy it and build it question, where should we be renting these services like cloud computing or maybe Salesforce as a CRM tool, and where should we be just consuming utility? And as you'll see, out of those 15 initiatives, which were focusing 1,500 people on, only 5 of them should be worked on in-house, and the rest should be either rented or consumed as utility. Wardley mapping is incredibly important in helping you understand your landscape. When we did this with a major oil company for $2 billion worth of investment, it completely refocused their entire portfolio. Next thing I want to mention to you is something called exaptation. It's a fancy academic word meaning repurposing. And it comes from research from paleontologists and paleobiologists. That's where the term comes from. And if you imagine dinosaurs, we now know that dinosaurs used to have feathers, probably for warmth, certainly for attracting a mate with big displays. But as my friend Professor Snowden says, enough of them fell off the edge of a cliff that eventually the feathers became usable for flight. This is considered an exaptation, a repurposing of something that it wasn't originally intended for. And this is very important when you're looking at new opportunities within business. And this is a simple example of exaptation. Percy Spencer, working for Raytheon, develops the magnetron, the device inside radar in military circles. At the time, and it's a true story, that the chocolate in his pocket was melting as he was probably cooking his leg and the rest of himself by doing tests with the magnetron. Raytheon realized what they got, rapidly patented it, and the microwave oven was born, and the first one was used in the late 40s, early 50s in Boston, Massachusetts. We then need to look at weak signal detection. We've been able to exact, we've figured out where we are in disruption, but then organizations want to know, well, the question I'll pose to you is, how do you know what you need to know before you need to know it? Imagine if you knew the impact of COVID-19 in the beginning of January. There were signals, but imagine that you'd reacted on those weak signals and planned to do things differently before we are where we are now. Maybe things for you would have been a little bit different. And we use a technique called sensemaking to do this, and there are tools, both digital software tools and physical tools, where we're looking and detecting patterns. We're looking, this is how we solve complex problems. You cannot use 5 why analysis and reductionist thinking to solve complex problems. And this is where we need to think beyond our lean tool set, more into the sort of complexity thinking world, and identify these patterns. And the best way to do that is exploiting your human sensor network. Listen to your employees. They're the best weak signal detection array you possess. And they are going to need psychological safety, this ability to speak out. And I loved what Tom Bell from Rolls-Royce was saying yesterday about having his management team configured in a way that there was too many people for them to manage. The management team was too small to manage people, but big enough to lead people. And then you can extend that analysis through what we call network analysis, where you query your extended networks. You've obviously exploited the company ecosystem. You now start to work with your vendors, your suppliers, your partners, extending the eyes and ears of the company. And there are ways to conduct surveys which are different to Likert style surveys, which allow you to gather data points which are not biased by cognitive heuristics and allow you to detect the patterns to make better decisions to enable you to save yourselves for the future. What prevents this? Two things. Groupthink. Groupthink's a term that was coined by William White some years ago, which means that going to these meetings and the senior person in the meeting is holding the meeting. And this is even worse when we're doing remote meetings. And their opinion sways the agreement of all the other participants. So they all agree when actually they're disagreeing, but they're afraid to speak out through a lack of psychological safety. And then we move into mindlessness, and this affects quite a lot of people, both executives and analysts, where we get this fixation bias and relaxation bias, where we become so preoccupied with a few central signals, we ignore all the things around us in the periphery. So we have another poll question. I'm going to hand back to Dan. Do you think your organization is missing weak signals? Okay, I think we're coming back. Wow, 69% say yes. So there is certainly some significant interest, and of course you've made contact me to learn about some of these tools afterwards, but I'm going to give you one of the tools. If you use visual displays, and-on displays, physical boards, digital boards, whether they're for Kanban or for using in Scrum teams or just on your plant floor. And I'm going to give a quick call out here to my friends at Cambridge Air, John Kramer and Mark Braun, and the whole Cambridge Air Solutions team, because they've allowed me to experiment a lot in their plant. They have an exceptional lean facility, and they allowed me to teach them Scrum and Agile concepts, and they introduced a lot of the concepts, and this is one of the concepts I'm going to mention to you. So big thanks to them to let me experiment. If you have a and-on display or some sort of board, what you need is your team lead, maybe it's a supervisor, maybe it's a coach, be it a Scrum Master or a Lean Navigator. And as events start to occur during the working day, whether that's remotely or in person, you now need to start using your digital capability, whether it's an iPhone to take a video, a photograph, some audio. You write on a Post-it note, a digital equivalent, if not a physical one, what occurred and when it occurred and what the outcomes were. Because when you move to your lessons learned meetings, your retrospectives, your hand sign meetings, your post-mortems, what tends to happen, you forgot all the facts that occurred. The weak signals are in these messages, in these little narratives and stories that you've collected. And when you move into those hand-sign type sessions, you actually now need to move into what Scott Tannenbaum calls debriefing. We want to debrief what happened during the last work cycle. You do this every day in your daily stand-ups and daily scrums, but when we move to a proper retrospective, we need to debrief what happens and not fill in the details. And I'm sorry, but retrospectives aren't where we do silly team building games with pasta sticks and marshmallow, lumps of marshmallow. So let me talk to you a little bit about the flow system. I'm not going to go into this in massive detail, but the flow system is something I was working on about 3 years ago, and this is a joint effort with Professor Turner at the University of North Texas and one of my co-collaborators who is from the US Navy. We wanted to evolve lean thinking. We wanted to go beyond the Toyota production system and Toyota way we wanted to bring in the Agile and Scrum context that I've been working with at Toyota, but we needed to bring in the complexity thinking, which is some of the things I've been describing to you this morning. We also needed to describe new forms of leadership, which is known as distributed leadership, which is where we need centralized coordination, but we need distributed decision making. And of course, we don't want to ignore the science of teams and teamwork, because we train our teams how to do great work, task work, activity, but we very rarely train them how to be teams. So we need to bring that into the conversation. The three elements of three core principles of the flow system is customer first focus for value, the flow of value with the triple helix of complexity thinking, distributed leadership, and team science. The flow system is not another framework. It is not another transformation strategy. What it is a system of learning and understanding. It's been designed to help you learn and understand what you need. It guides your thinking. It doesn't tell you what to do. And it covers those three areas of complexity thinking, distributed leadership, and team science, built on a foundation of Toyota's production system and lean thinking. And some of the ideas I'm giving you today come from this. So in the latter part of this, before we wrap up for questions, I wanted to sort of talk about what really matters most. Since 1946, Toyota have always believed the customer mattered most. The Toyota production system is about eliminating waste to reduce cost so that we can serve the customer effectively. And the first customer first promise was coined in 1946 by Kamiya-san, the first president of Toyota Motor Sales, which he said the primary focus of the car manufacturer must always be the customer. And Edwards Deming said this in 1952 when he talked about quality. It has no meaning except with reference to the customer's need. And our friend Peter Drucker went on to say there's only one valid definition of business purpose: to create a customer. Without a customer, you have no business. Yes, put your employees at the front, but only once you've gained a customer, and then train and nurture your employees to sustain and look after those customers. And as Drucker said, results only exist on the outside. Remember that customers versus users. Just because you've got happy users and you're super efficient doesn't mean your customers are happy and you are actually delivering great value. And value must be relevant. Value is only valuable if someone values your value. And once the perception of your value wanes, so does your relevance and need to exist. And this is how value is defined. And this is not me, this is the industry saying that any activity that adds value to a product or service being processed adds value to that product. And then that activity should physically change the product or service by being processed. And if the customer was well informed, the customer would be willing and able to pay for that change to happen, and they would care. And of course, the activity is done right the first time. We do need to eliminate defects. They're not value added, they're just a cost. And Ono talked about this when he talked about optimizing flow efficiency. He says, all we're doing is looking at the timeline from the moment the customer gives us the order to the point when we collect the cash. And what a lot of people do is they go and reorganize the deck chairs, move their people around, reorganize the silos in organizations. People report to new leaders, but they forget to optimize the operation for the flow of value to a customer. And the reality is here that organizations are organized vertically, but value flows horizontally. And I use this next slide, which will have a small animation, apologize for. I used this slide at AME last November in Chicago, and there's about 2,000 people in the audience. And when I described this, there was a gasp went around all my lean colleagues in the room. I didn't think they got this, that movement is not flow. Just because your products or work or people are moving and things are moving around doesn't indicate we've got flow. Movement is waste, and we need to eliminate all necessary waste. So what we've actually got is continuous value-added activity. Ford invented the moving production line. Toyota may have enhanced it, but the idea is the movement along the line creates value-added activity at every possible opportunity. And the small movement between cells is actually waste, but it's the best we can do with our current capabilities. So I'm going to finish with this by basically saying my work on the flow system, which evolved from my work at Toyota and on Scrum the Toyota Way, is focused, as is Toyota, on customer first in our foundation. But everything we're talking about is the interconnected, intertwined nature of complexity thinking, distributed leadership, and team science, and how they interconnect and intertwine in your context, and every context is different, to optimize for customer first value delivery. And with that, I'm going to hand back for question time with Dan.
Nigel, thank you so much for doing that. That was great. A few questions. Want to dive in right at the top. If you put the customer first, and obviously we all should, how do we make sure, how are we doing the active listening? And then how are we taking what we're learning and feeding it back into the system in meaningful ways that drive the things that you think are most important, but don't just create excess energy and scatter, especially right now with what's going on with COVID. There's a whole lot of like, we got to make a buck, we got to do this, we got to do that. How do we work effectively and efficiently based on what we're hearing from the customers?
So some of the work I did at Toyota was, and I give credit to the people at Toyota Connected for having implemented this, but they did simple things. I mean, remember, we were in a world where we could have contact with each other. This was still the physical presence world, but they actually took out into the marketplace actual mock-ups of small cars with the new entertainment system, the new infotainment systems in the vehicles. And they had people regularly come and play with those systems, and they signed waivers to allow eye tracking software and audio and video to be recorded. So we actually gave them weekly iterations over 5 months of new capability in those in-car entertainment systems, so those customers could touch, feel, and listen, and actually give us that real-time feedback. And every week, in what's called a sprint in the Agile world, every weekly iteration, we were able to make changes to the hardware and the firmware and the software thereon to be able to update these test rigs for people to be able to give feedback. We use the phrase active listening, and this is really, really important. We often hear people, but we don't often listen to them. And there are techniques, I teach people techniques to refine those active listening skills. And market research and leaving this to your sales department is not sufficient. You really need to be finding ways to talk to your actual customers. I had warrant that Rolls-Royce, who sell extremely large and expensive products to their customers, have very direct conversations with their customers. But if you're in a more of a commodity space, you need to use some of the crowdsourcing techniques, and you need to use some of the sense-making techniques. And there is software out there to allow you to do what's called mass sense making. And this is to allow you to ask people questions to get the data points you need without using cognitive biases in the way you ask the question that bias the responses you get.
And speaking of the disruption that's going on right now, there's a lot of opportunity here, obviously, because things are broken, things are changing. I had someone kind of a CEO recently told me it's analogous to metal at temperature, that it'll flow, but we can't stay at temperature forever. We're going to reset somewhere. So how do we take advantage of this time with remaking some of the systems that we've got going on? Some of the things you're talking about, improving, getting better. How do we use this time effectively to get better and then sustain those changes?
Yeah, it's funny because there's the old phrase, never let a good crisis go to waste, and that's very apparent now. I think a lot of people have been hurt very hard, both financially and in many other ways, and there's going to be a lot of challenge to recovery for all of us, myself included. But some of the things I've been looking at is that when everybody sent all the workers home, they suddenly started to realize that a lot of the things they did, especially what's known as office space waste, which is waste on the plant floor. You can see it's there, it's physical, it's visible, that you can make very quick changes to that. But office space waste and waste in computer systems and various other things we use is invisible. But when we sent everybody home, and unfortunately a lot of people got furloughed and worse, got laid off, so we slimmed down our workforce, but we continued to function. What that revealed is it revealed a tremendous amount of waste and unnecessary activity. Even if you look at the federal government in the US, they were able to rush legislation through and do things in 2 or 3 weeks, cross-party with huge incentive, huge stimulus checks and things, which would have normally taken 2 or 3 years, probably another government before we'd actually got there. So it's actually given us the opportunity to identify ways, to identify smarter ways to work. And in that sort of disruptive innovation thing I was talking about, we really need to look at how we can bring in exaptation, how we can repurpose some of our capabilities, our skills, how we can seize opportunities in this new world we're working in. I am hopeful that this sort of contagion won't last forever and we'll get back to some level of normality where we can work in person. But for now, we need to be looking at how do we eliminate all the waste that we were doing before that we realize we don't need to do now. That's a huge opportunity. Reduce your costs. Don't lose people because you're losing skill and competency, and the most valuable asset in your company is the knowledge in their heads. Do not let that go. You will not recover it. So how do we eliminate the waste to make people more effective, not just more efficient? We want effective teams and effective product delivery. I could go on for hours about this, Dan, but I think there's some of my key thoughts on this.
Is some of it just making sure that you're at least paying enough attention to document what's going on right now and take a snapshot rather than just we're busy in the work, we got to get busy on the business too and capture some of what we're seeing?
Yeah, we're very busy being busy, and I'm no exception at the moment, but we do need to learn to prioritize. Some of the lessons we learn from the Agile world, which can be brought into the Lean world, we learn how to prioritize, we learn how to understand what's important to us. And I mentioned my friends at Cambridge, yeah, they've warmed to the whole idea of what's called product management, which is a role that fits in product ownership, which is a role that fits in your product management group and your portfolio management group, about understanding what's important, what's valuable, and how we prioritize the work that we line up for our teams to work on. And they themselves cut, multi-year projects down to, sub 1 year by using some of these techniques. We do need to make sure we're not taking our eye off the ball. We do need to learn this weak signal detection. There are many examples in industry over the last few years, and some I wouldn't bother to cite here, but many examples where if we hadn't taken our eye off the ball, if we'd listened to those weak signals, we'd implemented psychological safety in the organization, we'd allow people to pull that virtual, that metaphorical and on cord and speak out and say, this is wrong, we have to stop, we're missing things, both in safety critical industry as well as for profit industry and not for profit, but also then hone those active listening skills so we hear what they're saying, learn a skill called leader's intent, which is part of the distributed leadership I talked about. And then actually we're going to be better prepared to take on the challenges we're now facing. And by collecting those real-time narratives through storytelling, through communication, various other techniques people can contact me to learn more about, you actually start to give yourself the right information to make decisions, to better prepare you for the future that's coming. And the next, as I go back to Tom Bell yesterday, the next 5 years of potential recovery just to get us back to where we were last year before we start seeing future growth.
Well, Nigel Thurlow, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. This is terrific, and hopefully, folks will get in touch and learn more from you. So this will not be the last of you. I'm sure we'll see at our events. Thanks.